Tom from Do-It-Yourself Home Automation, and in this case from 10.medium.com. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my story that came out yesterday on 10 about Mozilla's Internet Health Report. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that up, and let's take a look through it together. So this is the article that I published, and what it's talking about is a new report from the Mozilla Foundation that looked at the health of the internet. And they said they took the internet's vitals for the year 2020. And as I share in the article, this was obviously a big year for the internet. With people being placed under lockdown, people, having to respond to the coronavirus pandemic. Internet usage, Firefox usage, which is a proxy for overall internet usage, went up 15% overnight, according to the Mozilla Foundation. So when COVID started, literally in March, if you look at a graph, and you can see this directly in their original report, this is the graph of Firefox usage starting in March. You can see this is the expected number of daily users, and as soon as the lockdown started to happen, people came, onto Firefox, and that's a proxy again for overall usage, a much, much higher rate. And you're seeing about a 10 to 15% increase in overall internet usage through October when they gathered data. And it's probably going to be sustained at that level. So as Mozilla says in their report, people are using the internet to learn, work, connect with family, and in many cases to survive. People are getting health information, they're seeing their doctor. That has to be done now over the internet. So if you feel like you're online all the time in 2020 and now into 2021, you're not alone. You actually are part of a trend that Mozilla is pointing out that that's really true. People are using the internet a lot more. And also they noticed in their report that internet control has become more and more consolidated. So, and they say it's more concentrated. And I thought this was pretty kind of shocking, actually. Only 7 companies, and that's Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google's parent company Alphabet, Facebook, and then China's Tencent and Alibaba, control, I hope I'm pronouncing both of those correctly, control the majority of the internet's traffic and also a lot of its infrastructure. So that's pretty amazing. And you can see a graph also in their report of that statistic and looking at the overall size of these different companies. So not only are these 7 companies controlling most of the internet's architecture and infrastructure and traffic, but they're also some of the largest companies in the world by market cap. So basically, if you look at the top 10 companies in terms of their overall size, 7 of those top 10 are these major internet companies. The only one that's bigger is the state oil company in Saudi Arabia. So not only is power on the internet and traffic and also control of infrastructure much more concentrated in these 7 large companies, but they actually are some of the largest companies in the world now. So not only is tech more concentrated, it's also more powerful, more influential overall. And I think in a lot of cases, people don't realize that level of control and level of, dependence that a lot of other companies have on these large, these sort of big 7 internet companies. So one of the things that Mozilla pointed out in the report is that, if you use something like Netflix or Zoom, you may think that you're using an independent company's software. But in most cases, those companies that are smaller tech companies are actually relying on infrastructure from the larger tech companies. So when you're using Netflix or Zoom, Mozilla points out in their report, you're actually using Amazon Web Services because Amazon hosts those services and provides streaming for them. And we saw that recently with the Parler story too, that when Amazon denied hosting and infrastructure to Parler, basically that service, that app ceased to be. And I think they're still trying to rebuild from that. So, not only do you see that there's a lot of power concentrated, a lot of revenue going to these large companies, but they also increasingly control the infrastructure that lets other services like Netflix or Zoom, or in that case, Parler, operate. And as you can see with an app like that, gives them a huge amount of power over the way that the web operates. And again, that's concentrated in about 7 companies. So if that sounds scary, actually it gets a lot worse. Within that, 4 of the most used platforms, so not necessarily the most valuable from a revenue standpoint, but the most used platforms are actually controlled by 1 company, and that company is Facebook. So if we go over to the report here from Mozilla, you can see the top used social media platforms, and Facebook is the top used service. YouTube is second, but then look at the top 2 after that, WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger, and then also in the top 5, Instagram. So that's pretty amazing. Facebook in the top 5 services is controlling Facebook, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, and Instagram. So a lot of power is concentrated in those few large companies. But within that stratification, Facebook, and then if you look at Facebook and Google together, are controlling the vast majority of that. So if you think Facebook is powerful, you don't even know the beginning of it. They're definitely controlling in terms of the conversation, in terms of where people are interacting online. Probably the vast majority of that, with YouTube coming in second, part of Google. I think that's pretty amazing. And also one of the things that Mozilla pointed out in their report is that this has a huge impact on the flow of information and on the kinds of things that get shared online. So if we look at what happened during the coronavirus pandemic, you can see here they reported that they looked at a chunk of 8,105 YouTube videos that contained COVID-19 misinformation. And they found that those videos on YouTube actually racked up 71 million views on YouTube, but also on Facebook, Reddit, and other websites before they were taken down by moderators. So that's almost as many people as watched the Super Bowl that saw just this chunk of misinformation videos before they could be taken down by moderators. So the scale of misinformation, particularly health-related misinformation during COVID-19, is just absolutely vast. And again, this is live, so if you're tuning in, feel free to ask questions. There's a chat over on the side. And I'm just going through my my article from 1.0 this morning about Mozilla's Internet Health Report, which came out yesterday. So huge problems with misinformation. Part of that is that the recommendations of content online are increasingly driven by algorithms with either limited human oversight or no human oversight. And Mozilla found that 70% of videos that are recommended to users on platforms like YouTube are actually being recommended solely on the basis of an algorithm with no human curation or input or editing at all. So that's why you're seeing these misinformation videos spread so prominently even before they can be removed. And moderation is certainly important, but as Mozilla pointed out, the scale of the problem and the amount of content that's being consumed is such that it's just impossible to keep up with it from a human moderation standpoint. And the algorithms are really controlling things, but as they also point out, the biggest platforms don't disclose how they develop and train their algorithms. So this misinformation is being recommended by algorithms increasingly, but we don't really know how those work. And Mozilla points out, obviously, that's concerning. But even when people post content in good faith and they're not trying to be deceptive, they pointed out that there's still impacts to running these algorithms, to running the software and the hardware that supports these services that share huge amounts of data like YouTube. And they pointed out in the report that training a single deep learning model for a complex AI process like natural language processing, so that would be the kinds of things that underlie search or the recommendation of content in many cases, can emit as much carbon as the manufacturer and lifetime emissions of 5 cars. So, we think of the internet, I think in a lot of cases, as something that's kind of nebulous, this sort of thing that's out there in the ether. But in reality, they're pointing out that these things are embodied. These things have a physical footprint in many cases, and specifically training an NLP model, in this case with 213 million variables. It's a fairly typical model for doing some kind of complex process around search or recommendations. Because of the use of data centers, the use of a lot of electricity to do this training, actually that consumes as much or creates rather as much CO2 emissions as 5 cars throughout their lifetime. Um, so that's something to keep in mind. The internet feels nebulous, but actually it has this massive environmental and physical footprint. And so that kind of underscores, I think, the importance of looking at the ecological impact of AI and of these technologies as the world continues to develop them. But one other issue that they pointed out is that even though the internet is so huge and has this massive worldwide scale, most people, or at least half of people in the world, don't have access to it. And if you live in a fairly wealthy country, that might seem really shocking. But as much as we say it's a worldwide phenomenon and the internet is available in basically every country, a lot of people, about half of people, are not able to get onto it. And there's also disparities within those disparities. About 21%, men are about 21% more likely to have internet access than women. And that holds across all regions. So even in a place like North America, where more people do have access, there are disparities with men being more likely to have access to the internet than women. And there's probably a variety of factors involved in that. But I think the economics are probably a big piece, as we'll get to in a second. But just sticking with the gender questions and issues for a moment, another discovery that they had there was that across 14,000 young women and girls who were surveyed in 22 different countries, Mozilla says that over half, about 58%, reported experiencing abuse or harassment online. And you can see how this is broken down in terms of the effects of that. 42% had lower self-esteem or confidence, mental or emotional stress, and then problems in school, 18%. So, the majority of women and girls online across the world are experiencing some degree of harassment or abuse online, and obviously that's having major impact. So that's very concerning as well. Going back, though, to the issues of access, Mozilla looked at, why is it that people can't get access in a lot of places? And the biggest factor they found actually was economic. So they broke down and looked at the cost of a gigabyte of mobile broadband internet, and it's a percentage of gross monthly income. And they looked at that for a variety of different places. And you can see that in places in Middle Africa and Western Africa, where the internet is very expensive, 1 gigabyte of data will cost almost 12% of an average person's gross monthly income. So that's really substantial. You're probably making decisions between streaming data and affording food or affording shelter, certainly affording transportation under those circumstances. And you can imagine how that's not a large amount. 1 gigabyte of mobile broadband internet, most people in richer countries probably burn through that in a very, very short time period. So if you're considering this is how most people in some of these regions are accessing the internet in the first place, then that lack of affordability means, not only are many people not able to get online at all, but this concept that, people will be able to get access to the internet, and then they'll be able to do remote work and they'll be able to participate in the world economy, probably false, because with 1 gigabyte costing that much, if you can get online at all, you're probably not going to be doing a lot of streaming. You're not going to be doing Zoom calls. You're not going to be accessing a lot of video. You maybe will be able to do text messaging. You'll be able to do basic kinds of transactions, chat, and that kind of thing, and some photos perhaps, but you're certainly not going to be streaming, HD video or participating in even necessarily like a VoIP type of situation. So the idea that internet access will open up economic opportunities to people in other places, that's something that's not supported by their data, just because a lot of the time the cost of internet access is far too high. The cost of devices is high too. Mozilla also said that the average worker in some countries would need to spend up to 6 months of salary to afford a mobile device in the first place. So that's obviously a huge investment and probably a huge barrier to access in many places too. And I think a lot of people would probably say, okay, well, that's a problem in some of these more developing country kind of contexts. But Mozilla also said that this is a problem in the United States. This is a problem in richer countries as well. And they found a statistic I thought was pretty shocking. Only 56% of adults with a household income of less than $30,000 had broadband internet access at home. So think about that for a second. I mean, that's people that are at the poverty line, basically, or below the poverty line in some cases. Most of them don't have broadband internet access. And that's obviously a huge issue for remote work. It's probably a factor in why people who are in that demographic are going to be less likely to be able to participate in jobs that require remote work. But also, as Mozilla pointed out, it's a huge disparity when it comes to homeschooling of children, because in many cases, people are being asked to teach their children remotely. But if they don't have internet access at home, that's going to be almost impossible. And these are some of America's most vulnerable children to begin with. So those access issues become absolutely critical in the face of something like the pandemic, because they unlock or lock down a lot of access that allows for things like healthcare and allows for things like education. In the report, Mozilla also found other COVID-19 impacts. They found that contact tracing apps, for example, are being used much more prominently worldwide. And they broke down exactly when this started to happen in different countries. So you can see places like Singapore, Israel, Austria were very early. Other countries were later to introduce some of these apps. But in many places, they're actually compulsory. You have to use them. And that can create a lot of privacy concerns in many ways, too. They also found that there's a lot of internet shutdowns happening, and increasingly there's internet shutdowns happening in 2020. So shutdowns often happen when an entire country or region disconnects all of its citizens at once from the internet, and that's often to allow human rights violations to pass unchecked, according to Mozilla. And they found that every day in 2020, there was at least one internet shutdown somewhere in the world. And sometimes those last for hours, sometimes they last months or even years. So that's pretty substantial and pretty significant. We're seeing the splintering of the internet. We're seeing these kind of different chunks where people may have access or may have restricted access. And that's a concerning trend that Mozilla pointed out as well. Even in richer countries, though, they found that mass surveillance technologies are being used increasingly to exert control, even if the internet is still up. And they found that Europe in particular was testing mass surveillance like drones and facial recognition, especially on their borders against populations like immigrant populations. And they found that in the United States, the use of police technologies for surveillance increased substantially. So they listed some of the different technologies that are being used there, including automated license plate readers, body-worn cameras, camera registries, cell phone data kind of sniffers, drones, this whole sort of laundry list of places and services that law enforcement are using to increase surveillance in the United States. Again, it's a trend that they found to be concerning. Another thing they pointed out, though, is that oftentimes parents and employers are using surveillance tools as well. And sometimes these can actually be disguised as a tool for monitoring your kid's screen time or monitoring and managing remote employees. Overall, concerning trends. We're seeing access issues. We're seeing issues with the disparities in access to the internet. We're seeing internet access being used as control, and we're seeing surveillance and other kinds of things facilitated by the internet overall. They did find some, positive reasons for hope, reasons to think that things could get better. One of the big sort of positives they pointed out in 2020 from the Mozilla Foundation, enforcement of Europe's GDPR has increased substantially. It's increased every quarter since the law was implemented, starting in 2018. And you can see a graph of that. So the amount of fines issued under GDPR has been increasing. And Mozilla saw that as a positive thing because it indicates that there's more enforcement, more protection for privacy. GDPR is a major privacy regulation. And they see that as a positive, again, overall, because it's hopefully leading to more privacy, more enforcement of privacy laws. They also said, and as they said in the report, Belgium, Morocco, and certain U.S. states, Portland, California, New Hampshire, Oregon, are all enacting legislation that prevents the use of surveillance technologies in certain contexts. And again, they see that as a positive change, and a lot of that is coming from the grassroots level. Also a positive in Mozilla's mind from the tech world, they said that collective action on behalf of tech employees, whether that's gig economy employees or contractors in that case, or workers at major tech companies, has increased substantially. And even workers who would be considered precarious, so not necessarily the workers that are being paid a huge amount, but workers who are in the gig economy, who are working at a more of a support role at some of these companies, are increasingly organizing and protesting, and they've seen a positive trend or an upward trend across tech in terms of more activism there, more protests, more calls for collective organizing and that kind of thing, which again, Mozilla says they think is a positive. Diversity in the tech world is increasing a bit, according to Mozilla's report, but they feel that it's happening too slowly. The majority of tech workers at the big 7 tech companies are men, and the participation of communities of color, Black, Latinx, and Native American representation is basically about the same as it was in 2014. So gender diversity rising in slow motion, as they say. You can see the breakdown here at some big companies. A little bit more participation in 2019, which is the year they were looking at, versus 2014, but certainly not as fast as we'd like to see that rising, and really very little change overall on diversity, which I think is a bit, but not nearly as much as again, we'd like to see. So they'd like to see that increase and start to hopefully accelerate over time. One thing that they did feel was a game changer was the introduction of trustworthy AI regulations in the European Union. So that's something, along with GDPR, this could be something that they felt was eventually, as influential, could be as influential as GDPR was on privacy. Change can happen, again, at the grassroots, staff members, employees protesting in terms of how these technologies are developed and designed. And they gave the example that particularly AI applied to healthcare, agriculture, and civic tech are areas where cities make a big influence on the industry by their purchasing decisions. In terms of where to go from here, Mozilla says that racial justice, labor rights, and transparency are the 3 pillars that people should focus on in 2021 and beyond to repair the modern internet, to fix some of these access issues. There's essays individually. You can see them in my links here in my piece at 10.medium.com. And they've done really detailed reporting on exactly what they'd like to see. So you can break these down so they're not just sort of nebulous ideas. There's actually specific studies and things that they link to here that you can delve into in a ton more detail. So if you want to take a part in fixing the problem that Mozilla has identified here, these are the ways that they recommend mobilizing, the ways that they recommend working to make the internet a better place in 2021 and beyond. So overall, I think what I'm looking at here and seeing in their report is a picture of an internet that's experiencing a lot of challenges. A lot of those are probably things that existed pre-pandemic but are being exacerbated by the pandemic. Things like lack of diversity, like lack of access, like increasing concentrations of power and control. Those were probably trends that already existed and have existed for many years, but the increased use of the internet and the increased use of the internet for things like remote work and education has really made those access issues and quality issues much more acute and much more urgent, and probably worsened a lot of them as well. But again, there's cause for optimism. There's steps forward in terms of more grassroots organizing, more grassroots advocacy from people all over the tech world and beyond, and also different legislation, things like GDPR expanding, the introduction of new similar legislation in other places. And so Mozilla does think that overall there's a good possibility here towards making improvements and making changes. You can read the full piece if you want to see more about this at 10.medium.com. You can follow me there. I'm also at medium.com/@TomSmith585 or on Twitter at TomSmith585. Please subscribe to my channel here on YouTube as well for more of these live streams about my pieces. And you can see a lot of my writing at debugger.medium.com as well. Thanks for tuning in.